Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the strengths that are very prevalent in autism and to try to give a picture to be able to illuminate the autistic thought process as compared to the neurotypical or NT thought process. So to get started, first I'm going to talk about socialization. And I'm going to mention an example to help you understand some of the differences. So I do a Tuesday night dinner. I meet with my best friend every week. We eat dinner together. One of us makes dinner for the other, and we alternate each week. And so one really interesting thing is that the way that we socialize is completely different from the way that neurotypical people socialize. So usually when NTs socialize, they have to make eye contact constantly to know that the other person is paying attention. They'll maybe look at each other's body language. Maybe there is some kind of a need for knowing one's status in relationship to the other person, whether it's higher status or lower status. And then if it's higher status, the dopamine boost associated with it, and so forth. Or just having a conversation and dealing with the general vibe, feeling the general vibe of a conversation without really caring anything about what's talked about. So this is vastly different from most neurodivergent communication and socialization. So whenever I meet with my friend, we sit together, but we sit side by side. We sit side by side because neither one of us really needs to look at the other person. In fact, we have all the information that we need just from voice alone. We can both hear tremendous information just from voice, and nothing else is really needed. In fact, last time she mentioned that she realized we had only made eye contact once the entire night. And so to someone who's neurotypical, this would be shocking. Like, how could you even communicate if you're not even looking at the other person? But the thing is that we don't need that. I can hear everything that is going on, her reactions to things, her emotional states, her interest level, and everything just from her voice alone. And she can hear the same thing for me. So we don't even need to make eye contact. It's pointless. We both don't really get anything out of it. Neither of us like it. So we sit side by side and we talk. And we talk and we listen to each other, and it's really wonderful. And so we'll start on one particular topic and we'll end up covering literally over like 200 topics. We'll start on one thing and end up on something completely unrelated, but then somehow make it back to the original point. And one thing that's really special about neurodivergent communication is that the way that neurodivergent people connect with others is to offer a relatable story. So if someone is listening to you, if they're neurodivergent, if they're really listening and really interested in what you're saying, they're probably going to share a relatable story, something that happened to them to show that they can relate to you. And so we do this all the time, every week. It's so funny. We literally bounce off each other. She'll share a story of something that happened in her week. I'll share a story, and then she'll share a story that she remembered because of my story, and we just keep bouncing off of each other, going back and forth, but with different topics. So at the end of the night, we started off the conversation on work or something, I don't know, and then ended up talking about bananas and the history of bananas, or end up talking about like honeybees and the different kinds of honeybees and why they're important. Like, we'll start on one topic and we'll cover absolutely everything and circle back to the original topic. And I think that this is an excellent example of the neurodivergent thinking process. So what I observe is that most neurotypical people really only, when they start talking about something, they really only want to focus on that one thing. It's like a very streamlined way of thinking. It would be like if you are going from point A to point B. You're going to go straight there, taking the shortest path. But neurodivergent communication is not at all like this. In fact, the phrase "stop and smell the roses" really applies here. Neurodivergent communication is like, okay, I'm driving to the gas station. Oh my gosh, I see some flowers over there. Those flowers are so beautiful. Let me drive over here and take a picture of them. And then when you're driving to look at the flowers, you see a cute dog and you drive over, park your car, get out of your car, walk to the dog and pet it, with permission, of course. And so the point is that it's more like a spider web. Thinking from an autistic perspective is more like a spider web. So you think about one topic, and that topic makes you think of 57 other topics. And then those 57 topics branch out into 57 more, and before you know it, it's a giant spider web. So instead of going from point A to point B, like a direct, streamlined approach, it's honestly a lot more similar like a spider web or like a mushroom mycelium, the way that mycelium just branches out and continues moving constantly. There's honestly a lot of similarities there that I won't get into. But the point is that the communication style is completely different. And sometimes this can cause some problems. So to someone who's neurotypical, sometimes when they listen to me in the way that I speak, either they think I'm not focused because I am mentioning so many different topics in one conversation, or they think that it's overwhelming. People sometimes feel overwhelmed from the amount of information that I'm able to convey in a short period of time. I've been told that I talk really fast. I don't even try to talk fast a lot of times. It just kind of comes to me naturally. And so sometimes it's difficult to slow down the delivery of information and things like that for people to be able to understand what I'm saying. But the thing about this is that autistic communication is also a spectrum. If you take someone who doesn't have many support needs, someone like me, someone who thinks really quickly, someone who's passionate about learning and has almost an insatiable desire to learn everything that I can, it's going to be a very different story compared to someone who is level 3 and can't feed themselves. And I think that's one of the problems with talking about autism so much, because I have no frame of reference for what life is like for people who are autistic with higher support needs. I'm making this podcast to highlight autism awareness and the many forms that it can take, but the truth is that I don't have any level 2 or level 3 autistic friends or any reference to know what that's truly like, and ultimately the only person who can comment on something like that is the person living the experience. I will say, though, that I think that autistic thinking is very much like the spider web analogy and very much dependent on the process. So if I learn something, I will remember it and learn it only after I've gotten all of the necessary details for me to remember it, which means everything. There's basically, I don't want to filter. If I'm really trying to truly learn something, I will buy textbooks, I will take courses, I will watch videos, give myself as many resources as possible to soak up all of the details like a sponge. And after I've soaked up all the details, then the big picture starts to make sense. It sounds counterintuitive. It's the reverse of what probably 95% of the population does. Maybe more than that. But it's the only way that I can learn. At least from what I've discovered so far. I surround myself with all the details, and then like little spiderweb connections, the different parts of the web start to connect, and it's an unveiling process almost. It's like, wow, I had no idea these two things were connected, but that makes perfect sense now that I understand that. And so most people are the opposite. They have to know the big picture first. They have to see, how does this... They really only care about details that matter to them. Whereas autistic people, we care about all the details. We care about every tiny little detail, even if it seems insignificant, because these details are what consists and constitutes the truth. And the truth is the best and fastest way for us to learn. So if you filter at the details, it's like we're not even getting 50% of what we require to learn from. And so it's tricky sometimes. So that's one big difference between NT socialization versus ND socialization. I'd also like to highlight a few other things. So suppose I'm pointing at something. I say, okay, look over there. And I point randomly with a finger in a particular direction. Look over there. And I point somewhere. What do you see? Like, just pick a direction in your mind. Pretend I'm sitting next to you and I say, look over there. And I point. What do you see when I say that? If I ask someone who's neurotypical that, either they'll be like, what do you mean? Or they'll tell me what they're seeing in terms of like a giant square encompassing everything. So if I point at the living room, someone who's neurotypical would see the living room. They would say, I see the living room. If I point in the dining room, I see the dining room. If I point in the kitchen, I see the kitchen. If I point at a road, they'll be like, I see traffic. Stuff like that. This is not at all what someone who's neurodivergent or autistic sees. If I ask my autistic, ADHD, OCD, any person under the umbrella of neurodivergence, if I say, look over there, you know what they tell me? They pick out a very, very small detail, and they tell me that that's what they see. So I was at the pool with one of my neurodivergent friends, and I told her, hey, what do you see over there? And I just pointed randomly. And she said, well, I see that on the sign it says 911. Like, that's such a very oddly specific detail. That is not something that someone who's neurotypical would typically say or notice. If I tell someone who's neurodivergent, hey, look over there, and I point somewhere else, they might say something like, oh, I see that tire of the car has a cool pattern. Or I see the license plate. Or I see, whatever the small detail is. If I point at a painting, what do you see? Oh, I see that texture of that paint in the top left corner is slightly elevated from the rest of the painting. Autistic people have an incredible strength to see details, especially when it comes to visual details. Visual details are one of the best things about being autistic. You can literally look at something and see all of the tiny little details that get overlooked. I can look at a page and catch a typo almost instantly, and I'm not even looking. Like, I swear, if I had $1 for every typo I have found, I could just retire today. And I'm not looking for these typos. They just highlight themselves. So I'm a software engineer, and when I code, part of the reason that I'm so good at coding is that the bugs highlight themselves. It would be like if you're not a coder, I'm going to explain this in a way that does not involve you needing to know anything about software. Suppose you're reading a book, and part of the book is written differently than the rest. Now, imagine you're reading the book, and the part that's written differently is just highlighted. I mean, full-on highlighted. And you didn't do the highlighting. It's highlighting itself. A book that, as you read it, continues to highlight specific important things. Important details that you need to remember, so that no details ever get missed. That's what it's like to be autistic and to have this incredible pattern recognition ability. From all the statistics I've read, it says that statistically, autistic people can have up to 40% heightened pattern recognition compared to neurotypical people. 40%. This is mind-blowing. Like, there are so many autistic people online, on Reddit, who are suffering, who are put in these retail jobs where they have to socialize 24/7, and they're getting burnt out because their jobs are focused on socializing, which is the autism weakness. I guarantee, take any of these people and put them in a software position, they're going to excel. They're going to do a better job than anyone else you've ever hired because they can see these patterns instantly. It's almost like without effort, to be honest. It almost is. I'm not saying that I don't put in effort, but this is a natural inborn talent that I have because I'm autistic that I would not have if I wasn't autistic. I can look at a piece of code and I can see the bug. I can look at someone else's code and I see the underlying assumption that was totally incorrect. I go through life every day seeing everything as an algorithm. I was doing yoga the other day and I just kind of started internally laughing because I'm like, oh my gosh, everything my yoga teacher is telling me to do in this pose is a triangle. And this corresponds perfectly with all the architectural principles that I've learned. I'm not even trying to be analytical. In fact, I do things to calm down the analytical mind pretty frequently. But it's honestly funny because everything is an algorithm. Every single thing, even something you think is not an algorithm, it's still an algorithm. This is how I go through life. I see the algorithms instantly. I see the patterns in the trees that people miss. I find the spiders on the side of the sidewalk that no one even knows is there. I see another thing that autistic people are great at probably is cleaning because we see all the dirt. It's not really that pleasant. If I point to a windshield and I ask a neurotypical person, what do you see? They'd say, I see a windshield. But if I point to a windshield and I ask an autistic person, what do you see? They say, I see that your windshield has a bunch of specks of dust right here and right here and right here. It's all part of the strength of pattern recognition. And it's both a blessing and a curse because we are literally perceiving more information, a significant amount of it. And unfortunately for a lot of autistic people, this means we get burnt out. Because if you're perceiving more information constantly and you can't filter it out, well, the brain's going to get exhausted. The body's going to be exhausted. It's no wonder so many autistic people get burnt out so often and so quickly because there's just so much information to perceive. And in fact, the way that neurotypical people probably feel when I give them information too quickly, that's how I feel almost every day from a sensory perspective. There's so much information. And so the way that this works from a neuroscience perspective is as follows. The neurotypical brain is excellent at global brain communication. However, the autistic brain is excellent at local brain communication. This means that within a specific area of the brain, there are more neurons and connections in autistic people, but there's less overall globalized brain communication. What this naturally means is that autistic people are natural-born specialists, which is probably the source of info dumping and all that. We're specialists. We are literally specialists wired to be specialists, which means that if there's a research position, autistic people are going to excel at it because knowledge is very stimulating. A lot of us, so many of us, have a thirst for knowledge that NTs simply don't have or don't even understand. I can't tell you the crazy looks I got when I was in elementary school and I was so fascinated with whatever topic was being mentioned in school. Kids would look at me like, are you from planet Mars? How can you possibly be interested in any of this? They just didn't understand. There was such a huge disconnect because all the kids my age wanted to go and, talk to their friends or hang out or do different things. None of them really were there to learn. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world when we learned about the water cycle in 3rd grade. I was like, are you serious? Water goes all the way up to the clouds and it condenses and then it falls back down? Like this, it was just the most mind-blowing thing to me. It was honestly hilarious how much I was into the water cycle in 3rd grade. But that's exactly the point. We have a thirst for knowledge. We're natural-born specialists, which means that if you're a manager, right? Let's say you have your own company, and you're looking to hire someone, and you need a specialist, or you want to train a specialist, or you want someone who knows everything about a particular topic. That's what autistic people excel in. If you're looking for someone who knows the big picture, who's going to be great at socializing, stuff like that, hire a neurotypical person. I mean, with a few exceptions. Sometimes autistic people can be great at masking, and sometimes that makes us naturally charismatic because we get so good at copying other people's body language that everyone loves us, and that's a different can of worms. But the point is, don't hire an autistic person and then question why they don't know the big picture. Don't expect them to know the big picture and get annoyed when they follow a different process than you. Instead, this is what you do instead. You have, suppose you have a manager who's excellent at delegation and excellent at team building and socializing. You have that manager manage all the different people, but you tell that manager that for the autistic person to give them individualized projects where they can do things their way, because autistic people, like myself, typically value the process for everything. Autistic people are very by the book. Usually, we want a routine process to follow that works the same exact way every single time. This is why software engineering is such a good field for autistic people, because it's like kind of a dream job. Code doesn't do anything other than what you tell it to do. The code does the same thing every time. The code is not going to change its mind, and the code is not ambiguous. But the point is that if you want to excel as a manager of an autistic employee, or even ADHD or other neurodivergencies, this could also apply. If you want that autistic person to excel, limit sensory stimulation, number 1. Number 2, assign individualized projects. Number 3, help the autistic person consciously understand the big picture. If you are willing to put in the extra 1 hour that it takes to help autistic people understand what is the big picture, they're going to excel at the details. And I guarantee you it's going to save you more than 1 hour of time on those details. This is something that my current job does extremely well. My manager will go out of his way to make sure that I understand the big picture. Why is what I'm doing important? Why does it matter? How does what I do fit into what the rest of the team does? And what are the core needs of the team? If you can answer this question to an autistic person in any job, what are the core needs? What are my core needs? What are the company's core needs? If you can tell us your core needs directly, then we're going to give you the best performance you've ever seen. Because once you have those written expectations, we want to follow them. Like so many people, especially autistic people, we want and crave stimulation. Like, it's not an option. Stimulation is a necessity, which means that little dopamine rush you get every time your code compiles successfully, that's what makes us such good software engineers. Because we keep learning, because we keep seeking that stimulation that fills the void. And so that kind of stimulation can absolutely be provided by careers, many different careers, not just software. I'm sure data analytics, statistics, research, librarians. Like, there's so many different positions that are amazing for autistic people. But I would say really anything that involves pattern recognition is a good fit, or anything that involves routines is a good fit. Grocery store, even. If you're stacking the shelves the same way every time. Anything that's consistent. Autistic people really love consistency. We don't really love change. We like things to be the same thing every time. And any job that enables us to have that level of consistency is going to be something we excel at. And if you're a manager and you're managing autistic employees, the best thing you can do for us is to let us do our jobs without interruption and provide written expectations that are measurable to be followed in an easy way. And so, other things you can do is don't compare the way that you would do something to the way that the autistic person would do something. I once had a manager who would constantly compare everything that I did to him. He once told me, he's like, why don't you do it this way? Why don't you do it this way? And he would try to control literally the entire design of what I was doing. And it wasn't working. It wasn't working at all because he was trying to force his way of doing things onto my work process. Obviously, that doesn't work for anyone, but it especially doesn't work for someone who's autistic. Because then it's like kind of a feeling of being trapped almost. It's like, I can't do things the way that you would do them. So then there's no solution there. The really, really excellent managers find a way to let people do their own tasks without interference. They find a way to delegate the tasks to the right people, and they find a way to focus on management rather than a technical solution of the problem. You let the technical people do the technical things, you let the managers manage. Having that separation is so important in absolutely every organization. Because what happens when you don't have that, if a manager is expected to be a technical leader also, then they get bogged down doing all the technical stuff, and it's overwhelming. They get overwhelmed, and then they no longer focus on management. And if you have a manager that isn't focused on management, that's a problem. Then the person feels overwhelmed, and then their employees feel overwhelmed, and it's just this horrible chain reaction all the way down the line. This is why it's so important to have such a solid upper management in a company. Because it has kind of a trickle-down effect. If you have a manager who knows inherently that they can't control, and they don't even try to control because they know that they can't do it, if you have a manager that is willing to trust that the employees want to please, and a manager that knows that if they simply provide the expectations, that employees will provide it, that's some excellent management right there. And so a lot of these lessons apply to neurotypicals as well. But it especially is useful for autistic people because it's really important to have written communications. There's a lot of nuances that can get missed. With written communications, there is no question. There's no questions, there's no confusion. There are specific examples. This applies to feedback as well. If you're getting feedback or giving feedback to an autistic person, write everything down. Write it down, because if you didn't write it down, it basically didn't happen. Write down their feedback, write down the specific example, and preferably date it. Preferably date it so that when you have the discussion with the autistic person and they're like, well, how can I improve? Then you have a dated note from XYZ date that you can reference, and you can say, in this particular situation, this is what I would have liked to see, and here is how I'm going to help you get to that. You got to be willing to give autistic people the support they need, and the support that each autistic person is going to be completely unique to them. So for some autistic people, this means they can only work remotely. And if you hire an autistic person who works remotely, you're getting a damn good employee. Let me tell you that. Because autistic people, if there's less sensory stimulation, that's when hyperfocus mode is activated. I cannot tell you how efficient my life would be if there was a mute button on everything. Like, I go through life wearing earplugs and can still hear through the earplugs. But the point is that if I can find some way to mute everything, hyperfocus mode activates. And so hyperfocus is like this intense, long period of focusing on a particular task that an autistic person finds enjoyable, where it's almost an obsession. It's this intense focus where all energy is poured into this one task. Think of a freight train coming in and just blasting through absolutely everything. This is the power of hyperfocus. This is something autistic people do incredibly well. And when someone is in that pattern or period of hyperfocus, let them finish it. If you want your work to get done, let them finish it. Let them come to completion with that hyperfocus. And don't schedule meetings that interrupt constantly. seriously, like, autistic people are not good at context switching, or transitions, as school like to call it. Going from one period to the next was always a stressful event in school, partially because I had to try to sprint halfway across the school to get to the next class on time. But also the mental energy of switching from one thing to the next is really taxing. And I think that this is true for neurotypical people as well to an extent, but autistic people, these transitions can be literally physically stressful, especially for autistic people who have higher support needs. Higher support needs means that your transitions need to be gentle. Let's say you have an autistic kid and your kid is nonverbal and is level 3 autistic or level 2 autistic, either one. Going from bath time to bedtime is a struggle. And I don't even have kids, but I can tell you it's a struggle, because in the autistic brain, it's like, okay, I'm really enjoying this activity. Oh no, something is changing. I don't like this. I don't like the change. I don't like what's happening. I don't understand. If they're nonverbal, they may not understand what's going on. And it becomes this blocking process where it's really a stressful event. And so one way to mitigate some of these transitions is to find something to help the autistic person regulate, like stimming. That's one huge benefit of stimming, to be able to regulate whatever the feeling is in that moment, to be able to transition from one activity to the next. But I will tell you, even as a level 1 diagnosed autistic adult who has an independent life and capable of learning probably whatever I put my mind to, switching from one thing to another is never really natural to me. It's never natural, it's never easy. It's something that takes up more mental energy. So if I'm on a phone call and then someone else calls me and I have to terminate the first phone call to attend to the second phone call, that kind of thing really stresses me out a lot. Or if I have a calendar that is free, and then suddenly within 10 minutes someone schedules a meeting, just stop. Like, I can't. It's more than just an annoyance. I don't know how else to say it. With neurotypical people, maybe it would be a slight annoyance. With autistic people, this could ruin your whole day. I'm really blessed to have found ways that it doesn't ruin my day. In cases like that, I found really excellent mechanisms for emotional regulation and being okay with change. And I was also born into an environment filled with basically constant variety, so I had enough exposure to that from an early age that I handle it really, really, really well. But not all autistic people have this. And so change can be really a stressful event for autistic people, not just a minor annoyance, but like a game changer. So to try to minimize changes, it can be useful to provide written explanations of why the changes are necessary and help the person transition from one thing to the next. Other ideas that I had about this. So what I've discovered in my research is that sensory issues are often at the root of so many autistic symptoms. So suppose you're socializing with someone, and all of a sudden you get a stabbing headache. But you have to pretend like you don't have a headache. You have to pretend like nothing's wrong. And in fact, just even mentioning that you have a headache is enough for the person to stop talking to you, or not show interest, or look at you weird, or judge you. This is what it's like being autistic. Because you can't talk about it. You can't talk about your struggles half the time. Not even half the time. Probably 95% of the time. You can't. You can't say, wow, that was the most horrible motorcycle sound I've heard in my life. It was traumatizing. Because no one in a regular setting is going to even understand what that means. It's a very isolated experience sometimes, because there's just so much that you can't talk about. Even just me making this podcast, I'm 26 years old. I've been struggling with this in a lot of ways my whole life, and it took 26 years for me to be able to recognize these patterns within myself, to be able to figure out that I'm autistic and then get a formal diagnosis. 26 years of me processing and handling this stuff literally all by myself. I mean, I had a great support system, but these aren't the things that you are able to talk about. They're taboo topics. A lot of neurotypical people are really afraid of talking about things that are deemed meta, or things that go outside of the social norm. So these sensory issues are pretty severe, but they come at a bonus. So the bonus that you get with sensory issues is that autistic people can hear absolutely every single detail in music, or hear everything, whatever they're hypersensitive to. It can be both a blessing and a curse. So not all autistic people are hypersensitive to sound. I am, but I am one of probably millions. Others are hypersensitive to touch, hypersensitive to smell, and so forth. So these hypersensitivities are both a blessing and a curse. The curse is the struggles of everyday living, and the blessing is being able to use that skill to do something that you want to do with it. In my case, I used my hypersensitivity to sound to become a music composer and to hear every detail of music and to be able to copy it almost exactly. From whatever I hear, I can play it almost instantly by learning from ear. I just hear it. I have almost perfect pitch. I can hear what the note is if I think about it for a second. And this is definitely a strength. But it comes at the drawback of being able to hear electricity, hearing cars driving at night, waking me up in the middle of the night and really causing issues with my sleep, detrimental issues, where I wake up in the middle of the night from a super quiet sound that other people naturally filter out. So the point is that everything that you think is a curse in autism is also a blessing. And it entirely depends on your perspective of it. And if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of all my sensory issues, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't, because then I wouldn't be able to hear music and experience it the way that I do. I wouldn't be able to compose the way that I do. I wouldn't see the beautiful patterns that make up this reality. I wouldn't be able to see all of the beautiful details that people miss all the time. I wouldn't be able to appreciate that if I wasn't autistic. And so it can be stressful sometimes, and it can be isolating sometimes, but I don't think that it's as much of a curse as people think that it is. In fact, it's quite a blessing in my life. And I think that's something about myself that I would never want to change, because it gives me the opportunity to appreciate things at such a deeper level, to absorb things that I hear, things that I see, to experience life on sensory, hypersensitive mode. Is it stressful sometimes? Sure. But it's something that I really value. And I ultimately think that all sensory issues and all autistic symptoms are fundamentally a result of sensory issues. How can you socialize when you feel like you're being poked by a tack from a painful Velcro piece touching your skin? How can you focus on anything else when there's so many distractions and you can't filter out noise? Ultimately, in my opinion, the root of all autistic symptoms comes from sensory issues. Nonverbal, I still have not done enough research to say. I don't know. I highly suspect it's somehow linked to sensory issues. And certainly there are other parts of the brain impacted in autism that aren't necessarily related to sensory issues, but I think the best place to start when it comes to integration and understanding of autism and autism acceptance is to A, make these sensory issues known to the world, and B, make accommodations for them less threatening and more accessible. And the first step is sharing your experience. If you're an autistic person or a neurodivergent person listening to this, I encourage you to go out into the world and share your story. There's more of us than people think. There's way more of us than people think. And by sharing your story, you're going to raise awareness and make people realize that there's more than one way to live. It's not all about social status. It's not all about who has the most money and power. Being autistic has given me this incredible opportunity to make real deep connections with people that I probably never would have made those connections with me if I had been focused on something like status, or if I'd been focused on power or money or something else. Being autistic with no social inhibitions enables me to walk right up to strangers and just start talking to them like we're best friends. And a lot of people find that intimidating, but I think it's a strength to be able to do that. I really do. Life is too short to be focused on things that don't really matter. And I think that the more that we can truly accept all aspects of self, the better off we'll be. The more you can learn that you are inherently worthy, and you're worthy whether or not you are able to produce, that's special. The more that you know that you're valuable, that you're worthy of the world, then I think you've come to a closer truth about yourself. Self-knowledge is power in itself. Self-knowledge is compassion. And self-knowledge is knowing that you're not deficient. If you're autistic and you're listening to this, I'm here to tell you that you're not deficient. You don't need to try to force yourself to be like someone who's neurotypical. You don't need to. You're here to rock the boat. You're here to challenge the status quo. You're here to show people that there's other ways to live. Ways that are just as fulfilling as all the neurotypical ways. You're inherently valuable in your own right. And you're intelligent, whether or not you have executive dysfunctions and sensory issues. And you gotta be your advocate. You gotta be your advocate because other people don't have even the understanding of how you experience life to advocate for you in so many ways. You gotta be your advocate because it's what you deserve.